We didn't last long, 'cause I didn't show the time of day. So I wrote that last song, 'cause I had a lot of words to say. But this is a sad song, 'cause I never had a heart to speak. I'm walking away, it hurts me to say. The music wouldn't let me straight, and you never took me out to play.
So a little bit of background here, because this is based on not one, but a few different Shakespeare plays. There's a series of plays known as the Henriade that starts with Richard II, goes through Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, and ends with Henry V. Chimes at Midnight is mostly a combination of Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, but just to make it more complicated, he also adds a bit of Henry V and a later comedy that Shakespeare wrote using the same main character, Sir John Falstaff, called The Merry Wives of Windsor. But these bits have only cameos in Chimes, which is about young Prince Hal, torn between two father figures. His true father, the cold and calculating King Henry IV, played here by John Gielgud, and Orson Welles' Falstaff, a man who fully embodies the hard-partying fat rogue whose story this really is. So the question becomes, will Prince Hal fulfill his royal destiny, or be led astray into a life of debauchery?
Or do we need to care about Hal at all? The film starts with Falstaff and ends with us mourning Falstaff's absence, or rather Falstaff's body being wheeled away, and caring about Hal barely.
And the title, the alternate title of the film is Falstaff. And what Wells did was to edit the various Shakespeare texts to take Falstaff, who was in the original plays certainly a scene-stealing and very important role, and put him front and center in this version. So Hal is a more interesting character in the larger context. If you were to take this even further into Henry V, which this movie doesn't do. But if you watch this movie and decide you want to see a sequel, go get a hold of Kenneth Branagh's debut version of Henry V and see the story continue and Henry more fully fleshed out. But you're right, Al. This is not Hal's story. This is Falstaff's story. This is the story of, once again, a betrayed friendship.
Yeah, this is one of the things I so enjoy the most out of these like Directors Club things is when you look over the scope of Wells's work. Wells pulls from so many different things of his history, of his conflicts with the studios, of, in fact, even some of his works just immediately prior. And he pulls this together to make a very cool, singular achievement. Like, for one thing, do you realize that this is Shakespeare's Mr. Arkadin?
Oh, tell me how that is.
Look at Mr. Arkadin, a figure, a big, boisterous figure who loves parties and who has this level of basically shady disrepute, but it's done in a kind of a roguishly enchanting kind of way in Arkadin, but done to the fore here, right? And then, but look at how Arkadin is put together. Look at how Othello is put together, right? Othello is also done from four different countries, right? Mm-hmm. And yet it makes a consistent whole. Think about the audacity to go and take Shakespeare and where you said 4 different source materials, right? Once again, they're brought together to make a big, consistent whole. And then also look at like how he uses like this big buffoon force of nature thing, but just done to inform these Shakespearean subjects in a way that he has a big figure do the noirish subjects in Touch of Evil.
By the way, that you mentioned is even more impressive than you might know, because he first put these plays together back in the late 30s on the stage. So he had been plotting something like this for quite some time. Wells has said that Falstaff is his favorite of his own roles, and you could tell that he has such investment and joy in exploring this character who he clearly related to his own life. There's this wonderful book called Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, written by Harold Bloom, and he goes through every Shakespeare play and comes to the conclusion that there are two characters at the center of the Shakespeare canon, Hamlet and Falstaff. Now that's controversial among Shakespeare scholars, but it's interesting in the context of this discussion because you can't overestimate how big a character Falstaff is, how much a force of nature, how even, and especially as portrayed by Wells, he is this life-affirming figure of excess, of eating too much, drinking too much, sleeping with too many women, and embodying all that with such a sense of abandon and joy. He is such a pure version of his type that the Hal story becomes interesting because this is kind of such a romantic temptation for a young man growing up whose other alternative is the responsibility of royalty and his family heritage.
Mm-hmm. The visual depiction of these two very, very different father-esque figures, because Falstaff is hardly any decent father or decent human for that matter, cannot be more stark, because Falstaff's scenes are full of wondrous, chaotic motion and energy and just scattershot randomness. But when you get to Gielgud's location, it's so empty and humorless and dour, and all the stuff that's said is just in such a formal manner. And Gielgud is very effective at playing a real stiff of a human being who nevertheless has a lot of depth in how he approaches his ne'er-do-well son, and yet also, since he didn't really get to the crown by reputable means, he's sort of ambiguous on the kind of things he needed to do to get to be in that position.
Right, and he's facing a rebellion himself by the allies of the earlier king he deposed. Mm-hmm. But what's striking about the Gielgud scenes is the lighting and the use of the castle, which seems so immense, with the shafts of dusty light coming through the windows and illuminating the set in such an evocative way. These castle scenes are the most visually impressive ones of the two environments, while the scenes in the Boar's Head Tavern look more naturalistic, but are brought to life by the characters.
I would go and say mostly brought by the character.
Yes.
Falstaff cannot help but just impose his presence on wherever environment he finds himself in, and it's just a delight to watch. This may be like actually Wells's most effusively positive performance with there's one in his later filmography that comes close. But up until this point, he's been playing flawed figures and figures who rage, figures who have doubts and so on. But Falstaff, just plows through for the most part. He is, like you said, he's just this force, and he's always willing to go and go for a scheme or an extra chance at a drink or an extra chance at some money or an extra chance to cheat somebody or fool somebody. And I think that's kind of interesting how it seems Welles at his most positive is also Welles at his most disreputable.
There's a line that I think really sums that up well. Hal and Falstaff are role-playing, and Falstaff is playing Hal, and Hal is playing his father, King Henry IV. And he has this great line, and he says, "Banish plump Jack and banish all the world," which really sums it up for me that he represents not just himself, but this entire way of life. But then in an equally ominous bit of foreshadowing, Hal says, "I do, I will."
This leads to two particular things that keep me as a Shakespeare neophyte away from really fully enjoying this picture. One of which is that, unlike Macbeth and Othello in a weird way, that in a lot of cases, the dialogue just defeated me in a lot of points. This is not helped, by the way, that Chimes at Midnight had, for the longest time, the worst ever sound recording, and leading to many sections to be barely listenable to understand what is going on. Thankfully, Criterion had cleaned up the sound, and you can hear it. Nevertheless, the dialogue came across to me in a lot of cases as so quick, and there's so many different things going on that I was left lost. One thing I can tell for people listening that will be really helpful is 3 different things. First off is that in the beginning, I was really screwed around by characters meeting up with King Henry IV, and then later they're talking about boy, this Bolingbroke guy, I got a pox on this Bolingbroke. It only took me later showings to realize that Bolingbroke was the original name of King Henry IV. So when they're talking about Bolingbroke, it's about him. And secondly there's a moment where people are getting recruited, and these people are more and more incompetent and more inadequate for the task of being part of a battle. And Falstaff just keeps saying, prick him, prick him, prick him. This is nothing salacious. It just means pick this poor schmuck to be drafted. But the worst one for me, actually, was continually through this boar's head. They just keep talking about sack. Oh, bring me the sack. Let's see what's in the sack. And yet no sack would ever arrive. No, in the sense of a bag. So I'm just, where is this sack? What is this magic sack? What the hell is in this sack? And sack is just an old term for a kind of alcohol of which Falstaff and Hal partake in.
Specifically a type of wine.
Yes, exactly. But so when they talk about sack, you're just talking about drinking wine and lots of it.
Anytime you approach a Shakespeare film that uses the original Shakespearean language, there's going to be a period of adjustment if you're not used to it. And this is a more complicated story than Macbeth or Othello, for one reason, because it's got elements of a number of different plays combined. Scenes are rearranged. The scene that opens the film where Falstaff uses the line, "Chimes at midnight, oh the days we have seen the chimes at midnight," talking about their lost youth, is placed at the beginning, whereas in the plays it would have taken place far later. It's also interesting in that it's categorized under Shakespeare's history plays, which have a different feel to them than the high tragedies of Macbeth and Othello. But unique among the history plays is the inclusion of Falstaff, who is not a historical figure.
So he was kind of sort of a comic relief, or more meant to be a guide for people in those plays?
Well, he certainly provides comic relief, but I do agree with Bloom that Shakespeare actually means Falstaff to represent something very primal in human nature. So I think he's far more than comic relief.
Yeah. And speaking on comic relief, the other issue I had on it is that Prince Hal, played by Keith Baxter, there's moments where he is cavorting with Falstaff, where he just looks stupid to me. just like, for one thing, it is unfortunately not helped that he is a very, very close approximation to Anthony Perkins. And the thought of King Anthony Perkins is pretty unbelievable the moment you mention it. But then also, when he's cavorting around with Falstaff, he is mugging and bulgy-eyed, goony laugh, stupid grin. I mean, it's Pee-wee Shakespearean playhouse with this guy every time he's next to Falstaff. And I found it as a massive turnoff the first time I saw it. Then watching this later for this podcast, I just realized that when Baxter is playing next to Gielgud and is supposed to play a person trying to seriously appropriate the role of an upcoming king, he's actually very good in that one. And he's very good when he meets a fellow young rival for the throne, the Hotspur.
Also named Harry. Yeah. A lot of people named Harry, Hal, and Henry here.
All right. Apparently, the British did not quite get to I in the dictionary when it came to naming. But that's interesting that they share the same name because, right, they are in competition for the same would-be role, right? And they both have a level of mutual respect for each other. So those work well. So I ultimately think what's the quote-unquote matter is that Wells and Falstaff are so great and so fully convincing in their exuberant, wild abandon that Baxter cannot help escape that gravity of what he does. Because here's the thing. Falstaff is phenomenally convincing no matter how goofy he is or no matter how serious he is. Whether he's like being hoisted by 16 men atop a horse, playing dead, like being fooled by bandits who are robbing him, or hiding in a trap door. He's never less than compelling. He's never less than wondering what the hell is this guy gonna do next. And I don't see a single wrong move in what Wells does and which ironically just highlights whenever Baxter does what I think is a misstep. It cannot help but look incredibly contrived when you see how Wells is natural at it.
Well, there are two things working against Baxter, I think both of which you alluded to. And one is which any young actor who is not considered one of the great actors of their age is going to suffer when all his scenes are either with Orson Welles or John Gielgud. These are monumental actors, monumental performances, and while I certainly didn't have any problem with Baxter's performance, he doesn't reach those heights. But when you talk about him seeming awkward and odd in his scenes with Falstaff, in a way, that's really what they're going for. That is how he should seem, because remember, he's in a place where he does not belong. He will end up taking his rightful place as King Henry V. But in order to get to that point, he has to realize that he's got to break from this personality, this misspent youth that Falstaff has inflicted him with. And we also see this through the eyes of Gielgud, who, when he talks about or first interacts with his son, is basically like you're a huge disappointment, Yeah. I kind of wish the other Harry was my son and not you.
Yeah, and Gielgud does really good at doing an epic amount of disdain, apart from even the dialogue. Just the way he looks down his nose. I think he literally does that to Hal early in the film is so very effective.
Yeah, that's a signature move.
Oh, is it? Okay, that's Gielgud's go-to move. Nice.
So we should talk about the battle scene.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think you can look at this film as a case of 3 different environments with the battle scene at the center because, as you alluded to, the Boar's Head Tavern it's very much a big self-contained environment. And the castle where King Henry entertains visitors and where Hal must go to finally meet his destiny is its own, very distinct. The 2 parts are very, very distinct. And what do we have in the middle where the 2 meet is this just epic display of conflict in its most dirty, random, and chaotic form.
Yeah, it's one of the best war scenes ever filmed up to this point. It makes a few dozen actors look like a few hundred actors, and it reminded me of nothing so much as those amazing battle scenes in Seven Samurai. Because, again, we're in 1965. The kind of large-scale hand-to-hand combat with blood and gore was not commonplace yet. And yeah, you do see blood in this battle scene. And it grounds the film because where there's humor in other aspects of it, when these 2 armies are going at it, it looks like something right out of Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, some Saving Private Ryan, because you have that sense of chaos and anything could happen, and a level of dirty invalidity to the whole pomp and circumstance of battle, too. Mm-hmm. It kind of does to our idealism of the knights at the Round Table what Quinlan does to the now knowledgeable police detective in a noir story.
Good point.
It makes it seem wrong and sick and dirty and a little disgusting and especially with the periodic look of Falstaff in a ridiculous suit of armor that makes him look like a moving stovetop.
Right,
periodically,
he's the coward in this battle. He is going to do whatever he can do to be wherever people are not swinging their swords.
That's right. You would cut from a shot from like these 2 guys wrestling in the mud, and then to like Falstaff just peering out behind the bush. You'd cut to shots of like a horse stampeding over a guy's head, and another person's chest getting split open with a giant club, and then it just cuts to like Falstaff attempting to scamper from hiding spot to another, and so it really takes the mickey out of that whole endeavor to kind of put you in a very weird place going, it's a great midpoint between all the would-be stark pageantry of the king's realm and just the excessive party fun atmosphere of Falstaff's realm, right? You know?
Right.
So it's a really nice fulcrum. And then obviously it does a sea change there as Hal attains more, not just like the mantle of king, but it seems that he kind of basically just said, well, forget it with Falstaff. I don't want anything to do with him. And it's so harsh. And I don't find in the movie, at least, that there's even a moment of where he just regrets it. It seems to be absolutely a complete clean break as far as he's concerned.
It's true. He's chosen his father figure, and he's chosen to be the king. And because this is Falstaff's story, we're going to get to what I think is the film's triumphant moment. But before judging Hal too harshly, the people who would have originally seen the play would probably have known the history and known that this kind of break was necessary for Hal to become King Henry V. So, but that's not what this movie is about. This movie is about what happens to Falstaff, and the rejection scene is one of the most heartbreaking and moving scenes, I think, in all Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And might lead to Orson Welles' greatest acting moment on film, because Orson Welles brings something to the moment that, at least to my knowledge and other versions that have been talked about, is new. King Henry IV has died, has reconciled with his son. Now Henry V is now been coronated, and Falstaff believes he's going to be welcomed into his world and get a great title and great power and be able to continue partying with now the king. He has all these illusions that he's going to be a very important man. So he goes up to Hal, who is now with his robes and crown and his entourage. He approaches him expecting to be embraced. And instead, Hal coldly says, "I know thee not, old man." And then we get to Welles. And Falstaff is devastated. Welles shows that Falstaff is devastated. But what's unexpected is that Welles gives Falstaff also a look of pride. Because even Falstaff knows that he's made the right decision. That even though selfishly he would want to be embraced, he knows that the only way Hal will ever be a great king is if he separates himself from his past life. So this mixed look of hurt and pride that Orson Welles gives this moment is just jaw-droppingly moving.
I wonder if that was something that the texts had really dealt with. Did the Falstaff character in the original Shakespeare texts have this measure where Falstaff would pride in how finally becoming an adult that he never would be?
There's nothing in the text that would say that. Now, of course, we can't know how Falstaffs have been played over the last 400 years. If Welles is the first actor to take this angle, or if other actors have done so before. But having read a little bit about this play, it's been noted that this was an original take on the character.
It leads me to thinking that, in a way, maybe Orson is kind of like Walter Payton. There's one fun thing I always notice about watching Walter Payton play for the Chicago Bears. Great running back, ran for thousands and thousands of yards. But every time he was tackled, he would always move his arm and just push the football just a little bit more. So he probably gained a couple hundred, if not 1,000 yards, just by that extra little push that he gave. And I look at what happens in Falstaff, and I feel that from Welles. I feel that he gave Falstaff that dimension in a similar way to how he gives Joseph K. in The Trial just an extra moment where he gets a level of authority. In the same way, like Falstaff, especially how he's depicted in a lot of the movie, he could so easily have been just a guy who wants to be a lovable buffoon who just gets his, like Georgie from Ambersons, he just gets his comeuppance. But it's too late. But that extra dimensionality where he goes, Hal, you're going to be all right. I think that's something that Welles just added. And which, by the way, I'm not sure if I'm on board with. I do agree with you that he does have that feeling in the end, that there is a measure of pride, and that is apparent, and it might be a titanically great example of his acting. But I don't think it's really honors the Falstaff that we've seen throughout that movie. One who has shown his pure, white-hot dedication to just trying to have, in the words of the Spinal Tap keyboardist, have a good time all the time. And the charm of the movie, for me, is how he, in every sense of the word, embodies that feeling And what is a guy like Hal to do when he has one father be the Gielgud type and another to be this type? It's two great opposites for which a person will choose.
So as the last of Wells's Shakespeare adaptations, I think he does here what he didn't quite do in Macbeth or Othello, even though those are also movies that have greatness about them. Mm-hmm. I think here he has made the definitive film version of these Shakespeare plays and realized what he envisioned so much earlier in his life. This idea of taking Shakespeare in his vastness and molding it into a story that can be told in 2 hours without losing any of the power. And so for me, Chimes at Midnight ranks with Touch of Evil and Citizen Kane as the highlight of Wells's work.
Oh, cool. Like I said, maybe this comes from my perspective that I don't have that kind of enjoyment of the film in the way that you do, but especially in context, when the way we look at his work, I just have such an amazing level of appreciation. When you think of the idea of taking all these great ingredients of Shakespeare's work and yet mixing them all together and literally creating the path of a character who is the side character of all these different works and making him just such a compelling presence from which you can reevaluate all that work. And having it be such a great, consistent success, especially with all the limited resources, I have to say on that level that Chimes is a triumph. You can see a lot of what makes Wells through a Shakespeare lens in Chimes at Midnight. It's the most Wellesian of his three and something that enhances them both, I feel.